Okay, good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to the meeting. I'm John Drake, and I'm Director of the Violence Prevention Unit here in Wales. So thanks ever so much for joining us today, and it's a pleasure to, well, sort of meet you. I can see some of you on the screen. That's as close as we can get at the moment. Just a couple of housekeeping issues for you before we carry on. Firstly, if everyone could mute your microphone and turn off your video just to try and save a little bit of bandwidth, that would be great. And then if you could ask any questions via the chat function. So that's I'm sure you've all used Teams before, but it's the little speech bubble on the toolbar at the bottom. And we'll be monitoring that throughout the webinar. Hopefully you're all happy with this, but the webinar is going to be recorded. And what we're going to do as well is send out the slides after the webinar with a little resource pack. There's actually probably more slides in the pack today than we're going to talk about, but I hope they'll all be of useful reference afterwards as well. If you've got any questions at all about the webinar today or afterwards that you think of, then Bryony Parry's email address is on there, and Brian is our head of comms, and we'll also add you to mailing lists for any of our future publications as well. We've also got a website as well, which is violencepreventionwales.co.uk, and many of the resources that we referenced today are actually on there if anyone wants to have a look. And of course, we're on Twitter as well. So if you, okay, so just in terms of the agenda today, so it is pretty packed agenda, but there is plenty of time for questions and answers as well. So hopefully many of you will have seen this agenda already. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction about the Wales VPU first off, and then Emma Barton from Public Health will be next on. I'm pleased to welcome Joe Hopkins today, who's the director of the EAT programme here in Wales, and we'll be talking a lot more about adverse childhood experiences. Vicky Jones then, who's the North Wales lead from the ACE Support Hub, creating a whole system approach from Charlotte after that, and then back to Joe as well for some summary before we go into questions and answers. So it's a pretty packed hour and a half, so I won't take any more time. Let's go straight into the first item. So very warm welcome from me. If I could just talk to you a little bit about the Wales Violence Prevention Unit first. So my background's in policing, so I was a police officer for over 30 years, and I had sort of the regional lead around serious organised crime, counter-terrorism. I was the police intelligence lead as well, the MPCC intelligence lead. So had quite a connection to violence, but I think the most important thing for any new team is make sure that we have a really broad team. So we're going to be talking a lot about whole systems approaches as being the essential element of violence prevention. So you can't really have a whole system approach to violence prevention without sort of whole system representation within the team. So a little bit of a challenge here for Wales as being one of the smallest VPUs or VRUs in terms of sort of grant receipt. So only a very, very small proportion of our membership are directly funded by grant. So we have about £400,000 from the Home Office we spend on people. The rest of our budget goes on interventions. What we've done in Wales is basically grow our team by people being lent to us from other organisations. So be that public health, be it education, be it CSE leads. So as you can see within that central core team there on the slide is a broad range of organisations. But to grow the unit further, what we've introduced is an associate membership scheme. So again, this is an opportunity for a wider group of partners such as third sector agencies to join us. So we've got a for instance, Action for Children, Welsh Women's Aid. So a real broad mix of associate members as well who work with us. And on the right hand side, we have there some of our providers and people who we directly commission in Wales to deliver service. So that's a little bit about the unit. We as I say, we have £400,000 grant, but I've calculated it would cost us over £1.5 million to directly fund all the people who work with us. So we're really lucky in terms of the support we get from all the different organisations in Wales to help to prevent violence. So if I have the next slide. So I guess part of this first presentation as well is maybe just a little bit of myth busting and reassurance as well for people who may not be so familiar with public health approaches to violence prevention. So this is the model that we use. So the mission of the unit is to prevent violence across Wales through the implementation of a public health approach. And I guess the model that we use to help do that is summarised on this slide. And of course, the first step of any sort of approach is to define what the problem is. So lots of work here. Many of you will have heard of the Cardiff model. Lots of work around data sharing, violence surveillance, helping to understand the problem and making sure there's no hidden harm. And I suppose a challenge then on box 4 around scaling up effective implementations. Again, the ability for us to direct fund implementations is more limited, but we are able to influence others such as police and crime commissioners, Welsh Government around where money might be spent. But I guess one of the main purposes of putting this slide up is also just to show, although this is a public health approach, I think many of you from all different organisations such as policing will recognise this as a fairly classic problem-solving model as well. So it's not that alien and not that unusual. The importance as well, of course, is to consider this throughout the life course of an individual, which is something that will come out far more clearly through many of the other presentations today as well. If I could have the next slide. So this picture, I could probably do the whole presentation off this picture, to be honest. As you can see here, there's a sort of simple way of interpreting this. It's a child sat there being subjected to physical violence, which of course is a adverse childhood experience, and then as that child grows up, ultimately becoming a perpetrator, and so the cycle continues. But I suppose, adverse childhood experiences are not just physical abuse. Here there could be evidence of alcohol abuse, drug abuse, mental health, could be verbal abuse. So this picture could actually, also show some hidden harm as well in terms of other ACEs. So that's the one element. But I think for many of the VRU colleagues who are on the line as well, there's another element here that it shows a child growing up as well. And of course, many of the young people that we deal with are older, maybe drawn into criminality, criminal gangs, and themselves experiencing adverse childhood experiences, but also flicking between being an offender and being a victim. So it's important to consider that adverse childhood experiences can affect children throughout the life course. It's not just when they are young and then ultimately when they grow up. And it isn't just about protecting young children for the future. It's also about, teenagers and taking that trauma-informed approach when considering teenagers. And one of the things I said about sort of myth busting there is sometimes I think, public health approach and ACEs lens or being trauma-informed can often be sort of talked about in terms of long-term preventative approaches. But it's as much about some of the interventions we do with people like St Giles Trust, working with young people, or Action for Children, or interventions at hospitals. They're all part of this approach to being trauma informed, and it can be done really quickly as well. It's not just about preventing harm to the generation that grows up and breaking the cycle. It is about that whole life course approach. So if I have the next slide, please. And this is probably just another way of showing, very similar in another way, really, about how a person can grow up as a victim of child abuse and ultimately become a perpetrator of child abuse. But the positive point is in there. There's also those arrows saying trauma-informed intervention, which could be made at any point during that life course. we don't have to wait. And likewise, if you've missed those earlier opportunities, there's still opportunities through work like through violence reduction units, violence prevention units, to get in there later. Even if we miss some of that earlier trauma, it's never too late. So if I could have the next slide, please. Okay, and just a reminder here, and we're going to go into much more detail in this around the different sorts of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and of course, as a VPU, we focus very much on violence, on physical abuse, but likewise needing to be informed by all those other adverse childhood experiences as well, which are around the outside edge. And much of the work we do in partnership with that wider membership is also around some of these other ACEs as well, like drug substance misuse, alcohol abuse, etc. So it's just a reminder really of what all the other ACEs are as well. If I could have the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Emma now, who's from Public Health Wales, and is going to talk in more detail about how to embed that public health approach, and importantly around building that evidence base. So Emma, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, John. I'd have the next slide, thanks. Thank you. So I'm just going to briefly present an example of how we've operationalised a public health approach to address trauma and vulnerability across policing, criminal justice and other partners. By first understanding the problem and the epidemiology and the causes and the risk and protective factors before looking at how we developed and evaluated the interventions that were implemented. So the Early Action Together programme was initially a 3-year All Wales national programme funded by the Home Office Police Transformation Fund. And it was at the time a unique collaboration between Public Health Wales, the 4 Welsh police forces and the police crime commissioners, alongside other criminal justice partners, youth justice and third sector organisations such as Barnardo's and the NSPCC. The key programme aims were to address the lack of early intervention and prevention activity when adverse childhood experiences and trauma were evident and families are at risk of poor outcomes, while also addressing the associated impact that this had on policing in terms of vulnerability and crime. So the programme was set to develop a Wales-wide approach to training and practice for vulnerability, centred on ACEs and implementing ACE and trauma-informed practice, which were operationalised based on the needs of each local area. So in turn developing a whole systems response to vulnerability with police and partner organisations. The next slide. So across the UK, we knew that 83 to 90% of crime and control calls related to non-crime incidents, including public safety, welfare and vulnerability. And the Early Intervention and Prevention Breaking the Generational Cycle of Crime project 2016 to 18 in South Wales recognised this level of police demand that's not related to crime. This project looked to understand the existing systems and responses to vulnerability and use this knowledge to inform the development and testing of new systems and processes to allow intervention at the earliest opportunity, whilst working with key partners to prevent the root causes of crime. So throughout this initial early intervention project, research was carried out using a range of methods with frontline officers and senior management, including observations, interviews, focus groups, analysis of force demand data and focus groups with the general public. And from this research, we learned that traditional policing with the focus on crime and investigations is not designed to meet the needs of vulnerability demand. Police are dealing with a range of vulnerabilities on a daily basis, and thus the need for knowledge, skills and pathways to respond more appropriately was necessary. As what we found is the analysis of police public protection notifications for an area in South Wales in 2016 indicated the vast majority, around 90%, resulted in no further action, with only 3.2% of child referrals resulting in care and support plans, and 4.2% of adult referrals identified as requiring additional need. This research provided the knowledge and understanding needing to develop a number of recommendations for operational policing. A number of these were trialled and tested on a small scale. However, this work was not carried out in isolation, and the causes of the presenting vulnerabilities were considered in light of additional research from Public Health Wales and further afield on the likes of adverse childhood experiences. Next slide. So looking at defining the problem. So the ACE survey research informed the programme and provided valuable insight into the underlying causes of vulnerability, whilst also highlighting that dose-response relationship between ACEs and poorer outcomes in later life, such as health-harming behaviours, crime, victimisation and poor health. And also looked at how resilience interacts with harm and looking at those risk and protective factors. So this research highlighted that often crime does not operate in isolation to vulnerability, and that the police do have an integral role in addressing childhood adversity at the earliest opportunity in order to mitigate the impact they have and subsequently the risk of negative outcomes in later life. So next slide. Thank you. So the third sort of cog on the public health approach saw the programme move from a police innovation project to a much wider national programme of transformation and a whole system approach. And this included the development of an evaluation framework to enable us to understand what works and for whom. So the early intervention programme and knowledge gained from the ACE's work around resilience provided the foundation on which the Early Action Together programme was built, with key findings and recommendations feeding directly into the current national programme of work. It allowed for scale up on a national level with further understanding, development and testing of more efficient and effective systems and processes in responding to vulnerability. Each of the 4 Welsh police forces established a local delivery team, which comprised of senior ranking police lead and a partnership lead experienced at working across different sectors with multiple agencies and project management and support roles. And each of these local deliveries teams had been set up to work exclusively as part of the Early Action Together programme to develop and deliver work streams that met the wider programme objectives. This allowed for programme adaptations to suit local needs, to enable changes to be built into current systems rather than creating new ones, and to ensure these processes were sustainable beyond the life of the initial 3-year programme. Changes in development of new systems, processes and interventions in regards to recognising vulnerability was evidenced by the Early Action Together National Research Team. A number of evaluations and research studies were carried out at both national and local level to evidence the impact of the programme in line with the programme objectives. Researchers worked directly with operational police and criminal justice staff to understand their experiences of working with vulnerable people and partner agencies, to capture the impact of the programme on knowledge, skills and practice, to identify barriers to implementing change and to ensure what is delivered is supported by a robust evidence base. Data was captured through our interviews, questionnaires, case studies, forced data on demand and wellbeing and quality assurance processes. Findings and recommendations from the many aspects of evaluation carried out as part of the Early Action Together programme continue to feed into scaling up effective policy and programmes in Wales and provide useful resource on whole systems working. There are a number of links to resources and evaluation and research reports developed that we've listed at the end of this presentation that we'll be able to mail out to everybody for those that wish to access those to have a look at in detail as to what we did throughout that programme. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Emma, and welcome everybody who has been joining us as we've been starting this webinar. Just a quick reminder to stay on mute, and if you have any questions, I haven't seen any yet, but if you do have questions as we're going through them, please do put them in the chat. There'll be an opportunity to ask them at the end of the presentations. So I'm Jo Hopkins, and actually this is my first day as Programme Director of ACE's Criminal Justice and Violence Prevention. Up till now I have had a few hats at the same time, so it's great to have a kind of a collective noun for the work that I do, but I've also been the director of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Support Hub in Wales for the last 2 years, and more recently Programme Director for Early Action Together. So I'm just going to take you through a brief introduction really before I hand over to Vicky Jones, who's going to go into more detail about some of this stuff, about really our shared vision and our shared ambition. And I say that because you'll have heard already from Emma about the Early Action Together programme and the preceding work that kind of sort of set us on that journey. But actually, we have created over the last few years in Wales a real movement for change, a movement towards understanding what adverse childhood experiences are, understanding what adversity more generally means in terms of what people experience and how they react to that. And we really now are moving continually along that journey of learning and understanding. So we are heading towards, and we have a shared ambition to have an ACE-aware and trauma-informed approach in Wales, to have ultimately a nation that is able to respond effectively to the adversity that people face. So although there are 3 separate programmes, and I'll go through briefly what they are now, what we see ourselves as is a fully aligned effort now to work together in our distinct areas, but to hopefully realise our shared ambition to create a Wales in where every child has the best start in life, and every person who needs support and has needs and other vulnerability is able to access that support on an equal basis. So we have the ACE Support Hub, which, as I said, has since 2017 been funded by the Welsh Government, which I think in total it's a 1.2 million investment, and grateful for continued funding for this year. But it was put together by a collaboration of organisations called Cymru Wealth Wales, from that common ambition to say, actually, from what we know around the impact of adverse childhood experiences, we can really do something in Wales to bring together all of the passion and the want to do something about this, and have a hub that enables us to share best practice, enables us to bring together all the knowledge that's starting to emerge, and to really move towards that systemic transformation that we're looking for to create a Wales that does all the things that we want it to do for society. So its focus is, and still is, on looking at ways that we can prevent ACEs from happening in the first place in children's lives, support those interventions that can make a difference when children are experiencing adverse childhood experiences, really understand what those are, and to measure the success of them, and to help and support every child to access protective factors which enable them to cope with what's going on in their lives, whether it is 1 ACE, 3 ACEs, 10 ACEs. It doesn't matter. It's about what that child or what that person has in their toolkit, if you like, to be able to manage the impact of what they're experiencing. So being able to understand the way that happens and what we need to put in place, and to build that community of practice to take all this forward. So you'll see from this slide that that's not very different from the ambition of the Early Action Together programme, and equally, as John has set out, the ambition of the Violence Prevention Unit, each working in their distinct programme areas, largely driven also by the funding obviously coming from Home Office for other programmes, but actually it doesn't really matter, because in Wales we're all working towards the same end. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we have been thinking about on our journey over the last few years is really understanding more about that context in which we are operating. So the wider context of society in Wales, and thinking about, if we understand adverse childhood experiences and the impact of them, and we've got so much we're so lucky to have so much great research in Wales to enable us to do that at a population level, but to really think about then, if these are the things that we know have that impact and increase the risk that somebody may have a negative experience later in life if they don't have access to some of those protective factors, which Vicky will talk in more detail about later. What is it then that actually means that one person is able to cope and other people find it more difficult? And we need to think about that in the context of what is the societal experience as well as the experience in the home. So what are the sorts of things that make it difficult for some people, give them a lack of equality, in fact, in accessing some of those things that may help? So we need to look at things like poverty, the impact of different socioeconomic circumstances, stuff like discrimination, racial discrimination, disruption in communities, lack of social capital, things like violence in the community, because that is the context in which we're working. So one of the things I think that's important to remember from this presentation is that although we talk about Wales, and we will talk about Wales a lot, this is a model that I think can be transported to anywhere, as long as you are aware and understand the context in which you are working and the environment and society in which you are delivering the actions that you want to take. So it's really important that we look at it in that holistic manner, because unless we do, we're only going to tackle the symptoms, or perhaps the outcomes of what really is the root cause of some of this stuff. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that we really hope to to kind of engage the public in Wales around this was through a public awareness campaign. So a lot of the work that the Hub has been doing, and you've heard already about Early Action Together, has been really focused on working with organisations, on sectors, thinking about developing that integrated approach, ensuring that everyone's pulling in the same direction. But one of the things that we learned very quickly, particularly through the engagement with those sectors and organisations, and schools in fact, is that it's no point in doing this in silos. We have to really understand and engage with the public to make a real difference. So we went out a little bit on a limb and thought we'd try something last year, which looks at what is it that we could tap into around the public, a simple message to engage people. And what I want us to just think about and reflect on just for a second is the fact that during our current circumstances and the adversity that we're all facing as society in the UK and globally around COVID-19, we've seen communities pull together. We've seen them looking out for the more vulnerable. We've seen them thinking about how they can ensure that people get access to food and access to pharmacies, medical supplies. So why can we do it in a time where we're all experiencing that and not perhaps do it at other times? So it's really important, and it's a really central part of our work this year, to really think about those public messages and engage people and understand what would actually make someone think, I have a part to play in this. So have a look at the video. Some of you will have seen it before. Thank you, Bryony. I'm not sure we've got sound, unfortunately.
Jack. You all right? What? Hey, Tom's outside. Why didn't you come round to ask for food? We haven't seen you in a while. Okay. Great. Hey, well, Tom, he's been put
Behind the child, there might be a struggle you can't see. A small act of kindness could change someone's life.
Thank you. So relief all round, it worked at the vital point there. But you get the message that this was a simple campaign that went out in Loose Women and Coronation Street on the television to try and get people to understand that supporting and tackling ACEs is everybody's business. And this slide just gives you a sense of how far that campaign actually reached. And I think one of the things that we need to think about going forward as we carry on this journey towards our shared ambition is what more do we need to think about in terms of engaging the wider public, and how can we build on those communities that really have strengths and assets that are really doing a huge amount in this space, highlight that and make sure that this is a whole society approach, not just the public sector or the third sector, and that we all tackle this together. Next slide, please. So one of the questions that often gets asked of me is, well, this is all great, Joe, but you can do it in Wales because you have things like the Future Generations Act, and you always tell us that everybody knows everybody and you have a great partnership relationship. And that's all true. And I'm not suggesting that it's not. We do have things like the Social Services and Wellbeing Act that permit us and force us actually in legislation to work together to really make sure that we are integrated in the way that we do policy and build the blocks for transformation. But actually, if you look wider than that, we can see that there are a number of UK structures, particularly in policing, such as Policing Vision and other action plans that can pull us all in that direction, can provide those building blocks for everybody. And it's fantastic that we've got a commitment in the programme for government from the Welsh Government to tackling ACEs and to reviewing that this year, in fact, to ensure that we are doing all that we can and all the things that we are doing are the right things. So that's a fantastic opportunity for us to really think about how we embed and sustain the approach that we've got. But we all have these building blocks. We all have things that we can use to really sustain and embed the approach we've got. And here's just an example of some of the things that are UK-wide and accessible. This is a model, as I said, that was built in Wales and is established in the Welsh context. But actually, the principles of it, we believe, could be transported anywhere in the UK. Next slide, please. And just to really emphasise before I hand over to Vicky, that yes, this is about partnerships and relationships and the value we place on that in Wales. And it really truly is a partnership approach across a number of different agencies, communities, third sector organisations. So, for example, the Early Action Together programme, there's a strong element of that, which is around the criminal justice system more widely, youth justice, as I mentioned, prisons and probation. So this year, following the end of the Home Office funding, the police have continued to do a further year of the Early Action Together programme to look at consolidating the evidence that we have and pulling it together in an overall ask. So back to that shared vision, that shared ambition, to say what is it that we are all hoping to achieve. And HMPPS are also invested this year in further money to continue that work. So when we do come together, we are a powerful force, I think, in terms of that overall ask. And it's a partnership that is enduring and is pulled together by the governance structures that we have in Wales, but it really is something that really provides that vehicle for change. Okay, that's enough from me. I'm now going to hand over to Vicky Jones, who is going to talk to you about what is a trauma-informed approach. And just before she does, I just think it's something that's important to say is that we are using the words trauma-informed approach, but we're very aware that there are a number of other phrases. There's an interesting conversation going on about what do we actually mean by this. So we've got trauma sensitive, trauma responsive, ACE aware, ACE responsive. So this is an ongoing conversation, but we just want to set out what does it look like for us at the moment. Thank you, Vicky. Over to you.
Thanks, Jo. Good afternoon, everybody. So just if we go on to the first slide, Bryony, because I think Jo's just kind of teed me up there, really. I am Vicky Jones, and I'm the North Wales lead for the Adverse Childhood Experiences Hub, working alongside Jo. And effectively, what we've got here is actually our ambition for Wales to be a trauma and ACE-informed nation. And I might refer to that as trauma and ACE, or I might refer to it as TRACE as we go through the presentation. But we have for some time, I guess, been on this journey, and what I want to do is to present some of the work that we've actually done in this space and the impact that the work has so far had. But as Jo says, I think it's fair to say that we are really alive to an ongoing debate about the language that we use and actually how widely understood this is. So effectively, that big question is, what does ACE and trauma-informed mean? Next slide, please, Bryony. Okay, so trauma-informed practice, we know, is not about the treatment of trauma or the symptoms, but rather a recognition that trauma experiences are a possibility for everyone or anyone. And it's really about activities that prioritise that physical and emotional safety so that trusted relationships can be built. And relationships are really at the heart of taking a trace-informed approach. And actually, it is about promoting opportunities for well-being, healing and recovery through the power of choice and collaboration, doing with and not to. And it's about empowerment that really helps individuals recognise their strengths and recognise the resilience factors and build on these. But ultimately, it's about an approach that builds trust. So effectively, it's about how we do rather than what we do. And I guess in simple terms, on an individual level, a trace-informed person understands that actually people are shaped by their life experiences. We all are. They recognise the signs and behaviours associated with trauma and are able to respond with kindness and compassion. And that seeks to really kind of avoid re-traumatisation. So if we just move on, Bryony. So everybody's heard this before. We know that we should all consider what's happened rather than what's wrong, and reframe the way that we engage with people. Asking someone what's wrong kind of indicates that they're at fault, there's blame, and potentially they should feel shame and be deserving of punishment. But actually reframing this to what happened evokes a much more understanding and is a much more nurturing response that promotes the ability to heal. And I guess Dr. Karen Treisman kind of summarises this really well when she says every interaction is an intervention. And I guess the importance of that from a violence prevention point of view or a vulnerability prevention point of view is actually this can be the difference between someone engaging in a healing pathway or a more destructive one. Okay, so what are we doing then in Wales to operationalise this approach? Well, I guess firstly, from an organisational development point of view, we've created a skills and knowledge framework. This is aimed at everybody becoming trauma and ACE informed. We've also devised a trauma and ACE trace toolkit for organisations to use as a guided process to becoming trace informed. And this really explores the principles of trauma informed practice across a number of organisational domains, such as the leadership, the governance, the design of that service, the delivery of that service, and the physical environment in which it's offered, and so on, really. But what this does is incorporates the self-assessment tool, and it's really just aimed to support organisations to reflect on what they're already doing with this within this space, but actually how they can improve that. And we've also got lots of training products that have been devised. Most recently, we've launched a universal learning product, which is now available online as that universal entry kind of awareness level of trauma and ACEs. Okay. So what are we doing in this space then? Well, all of what I've just described has actually been built on the work that we've done across sectors. And this slide effectively illustrates those areas that we've been working across on our journey to becoming a trauma-informed nation. And it really demonstrates the wealth and the broad reach of that work, from housing, homelessness services through to criminal justice, policing, probation, youth services, and so on. You can see all of those areas that we're working in. And I guess what I want to do in the next few minutes really is to shine a spotlight on some of those areas in more detail. So moving us on. Okay, so education is obviously a crucial area of importance for us, and our ambition is for every school in Wales to be strong, inclusive and trauma-informed, helping children to flourish and have the best start in life. So in order to kind of achieve this, we developed an ACE and trauma-informed whole schools approach, and this included an ACE readiness tool to work with the schools around, but also the delivery of training, which was actually developed in collaboration with our psychology partners, and that not only really concentrated on education and awareness, but it actually was more about responding to ACEs and trauma in the classroom through taking a trauma-informed approach with really staff wellbeing at the heart of it, but about promoting resilience and protective factors. And this is aimed at all school staff. It's not just aimed at teaching staff. And in terms of reach, we've actually reached 2/3 of schools in Wales with this training. 16 out of 22 local authorities are engaging with us, with 2 more recently having come on board in North Wales. And we know the impacts from the evaluation, and what the evaluation has told us is that actually staff report much higher confidence levels in identifying children experiencing trauma and its impacts. We've got a much better understanding of the underlying causes of behaviour in the classroom, and therefore we've got improved communication and support to children experiencing ACEs and trauma. And staff actually described kind of creating safe spaces and time, and generally being more responsive to young people when they seek support as a result of the training. And one school actually reported implementing alternative options for dealing with problematic behaviour, which has actually led to a reduction in exclusions. So Bryony's just flagged that up for me. Pencoed Comprehensive actually reported a 47% reduction in exclusions in the year post training. So there are significant kind of outcomes from this, really. The ACEs and trauma-informed approach actually also forms part of the Estin inspection, which is our Wales equivalent to Ofsted, and a recent thematic review set out really clearly the difference made to schools and actually corroborated those findings from the research which I've just presented. But ultimately, the most important thing here is that actually taking a trauma and ACE-informed approach in schools has ultimately led to better outcomes for children and staff as a result, which is exactly where we want to be. Okay. Okay, so our work with education is not just about the school, it's about the community that the school serves and supports. And a key element of the Early Action Together programme in Gwent was actually developing that relationship between policing and schools. And in particular, this kind of image here just shows the Headley Bach programme, which gave children really the opportunity to learn more about the police and to develop trust and really educate others. And many children within the programme were actually from families that have had challenging or complex relationships with the police. So actually it was kind of an opportunity to kind of forge those relationships and break down the barriers and provide an opportunity for prevention and early intervention really at the earliest possible point. Okay. Okay, so it's also really important to ensure that actually trauma and ACE-informed approaches don't end at that school gate, and they are adopted across further education and higher education and are actually sustainable for future teaching staff. So I'm really pleased to say we've been able to deliver the training to PGCE students across Wales, and this forms now a key part of their syllabus. As well, within level 2 qualifications for youth work, we've managed to embed this, and also in health and social care qualifications as well, so that we know that future staff in those areas will have the benefit of this knowledge and these skills. So I'm also really pleased to say that Wrexham Glyndŵr University have actually agreed to be the first pilot in the UK to become a trauma and ACE-informed university. And there's also a parallel kind of work stream currently being explored in further education. So I think it's fair to say that we're really trying to ensure that education is a trace-informed sector at every level. But building on this has been kind of our work with the youth work and youth justice sector to raise awareness of ACEs and their impact on behaviour. And training has kind of provided practitioners with a range of tools to support resilience and self-regulation. The youth justice sector, we know, have adopted enhanced case management approach, which allows a trauma recovery model to be used, and that's been evaluated with findings available shortly. And of course, sports is a key area to supporting resilience and protective factors in children and young people. And so in understanding that there are approximately 20,000 sports coaches across Wales, we've actually worked with key partners, including the Welsh Rugby Union and Sports Wales, to develop an ACEs and sports training package. So that's now ready for delivery, and we hope to kind of roll that out through this year, really. So moving on. Can you click on for me, Brill? Okay, so from a housing sector point of view then, we've worked with partners to develop and deliver training programmes and approaches within that sector. What I want to talk about is the psychologically informed environment stuff, and the approach really recognises that many of the behaviours displayed by the homeless population, such as self-harm, for example, antisocial behaviour or substance misuse, are actually a result of trauma. And what this approach builds on really is 5 elements to help staff work far more effectively with people who have complex and multiple needs. And this is kind of really changing the way we understand and tackle the behaviour that leads to homelessness. So the 5 kind of principles are really noted here. And that's firstly relationships, which I've talked about as that tool for change. It's about continuous improvement really through staff support and training, and the importance of that physical environment and social spaces, ensuring that they're safe and ensuring that they can welcome positive interactions between staff and service users. And above all, this is a psychological framework which really enables reflective and thoughtful, compassionate kind of practice, and obviously evidence generating practice, which we can improve on all of the time. So the impact of that then is featured on the next slide. So actually, when we looked at the PIE approach that had been taken in a particular homeless hostel, so through 1 year of implementing this approach, what we actually saw was actually there were 80% call outs, 80% of ambulance call outs reduced. Hospital admissions were down by 78%. Total incidents down in the particular hostel were down by 54%. So there were clearly kind of significant improvements as a result of taking this approach for the service and for the people involved. But actually evictions rose initially, but then they were down by 1 to 29, and positive move-ons increased by a huge 250%. So people and services are really better off as a result of taking a trauma and ACE-informed approach. Okay, so to move on to the next slide. Okay, so this is the criminal justice example, really. The Early Action Together programme has already been referenced, but this was really about seeking to operationalise that public health approach, as Emma said, not only in policing, but across criminal justice, in prison and probation. And it was really to kind of move upstream to prevent or intervene early to address the root causes of vulnerability. And the training that I'm going to describe in a minute was actually rolled out across prisons and probation. It wasn't just policing. And actually, prisons and probation, similarly to youth justice, have also looked to introduce an enhanced case management approach in working with vulnerable prisoners. But for the purpose of this, I just want to really shine a spotlight on the trauma-informed policing aspect. And really early on, I guess we identified that this wasn't just about policing. This was about how police officers work with multi-agency partners across the board. So with this in mind, we wanted to take that whole system approach, and we wanted to collaborate with our partners to ensure that there was accountability and joint ownership, really, of the Early Action Together programme. It was also, if we were going to reduce inappropriate safeguarding referrals that officers were making, we actually needed to provide them with other alternatives in order to ensure that people could get the right help at the right time, but officers were able to guide them in that way. A crucial part, really, of the programme was the ACE time training, which not only police went on, but partners were in the same room, having the same training, having that joint dialogue and that joined up dialogue about how we work collectively to prevent and mitigate vulnerability. And that training really took police officers on a journey and partners to understand and try and take the approach around what's happened, what are the underlying issues here, and how can I effectively support that at the earliest possible point. We wanted them to use an ACE and trauma-informed lens in terms of looking at the issue, exploring that a bit further, not judging it on just the behaviour, and actually understanding what needs sat behind that in order for them to effectively signpost, support or safeguard. Obviously, the training wasn't enough to ensure that there were those responses across the board. So post-training, we've actually been able to support in stations to ensure that that learning has been embedded to activate those different operational responses. And in terms of sustainability, we've set up different processes for referral and so on. And there's been local operational leadership from sergeants and inspectors in supervising their staff. We've also managed to have police officers be co-locating in early help hubs, which just really supports that kind of joint dialogue and work. So in terms of the impact that that's had then, if we move on. Okay, so what we saw as a result of the programme on the ground was big changes in operational practice. We saw much better quality referrals going in, and we saw a reduction in inappropriate safeguarding referrals, with an increase in the number of referrals received by early help services, which all kind of means, and ultimately, that people were getting far more appropriate and timely support as a result of those changes. We saw evidence of really good early help problem solving, and we saw much better relationships between officers and actually multi-agency partners. But just to show you this from kind of an individual level, I'm just going to share a case study with you, which relates to a 17-year-old looked after child. And in a 3-month period, there had been 9 police contacts. The main presenting issues were really around alcohol concerns, aggressive presentation, concerns about this young lady's associations, and there'd been numerous missing reports from her accommodation. And on the 9th police contact, this kind of ended in an arrest, the first arrest really. But the officer who dealt with that chose to do things differently and chose to take a trauma and ACE informed approach. And in doing so, reframed the way in which she engaged with that person and found out that actually this person had suffered childhood abuse, the perpetrator of which was just about to be released from prison, obviously triggering these kinds of negative behaviours as a coping and safety mechanism. She also disclosed that she'd recently lost a grandparent who was actually that safe, supportive adult relationship. So the police officer was able to make referrals to agencies to kind of support those needs and engaged with the college in which this young person was just about to start. So actually following that and following those interventions, I'm really pleased to say that in the 3 months after that, what we see is a young person engaging really, really well in college, and no concerns about her alcohol are noted. There's been no concerns from social services. Although there has been a couple of missing reports, actually those have reduced, and they have been as a result of her just being back late to that accommodation. So clearly this has had a different impact for her, and we can't say that that's all down to that intervention, but clearly taking this approach is a far better way in terms of leading to better outcomes for people. And it's not just about those outcomes. I guess there's a compelling argument in terms of time and cost, because actually when we did a rudimentary kind of cost time analysis, what we saw in the pre and post intervention stage is that 36% reduction in police and partner agency time as a result, and a 66% reduction in police and partner agency costs. And I'll just play you a video now of the police officer that was involved, which gives you a flavour of what she's been able to get out of taking this approach.
One of the things that throughout the jobs that I go to is people in time of need. We often see people at their worst. Typically, as most interactions with general public, is see them angry, at their most upset. I went with her in custody. We got there, in my hand, very much unsure, very much confused, looking for some sort of support, because she realised that she couldn't change the circumstances, and she just kept asking, as any young person would, for a mum. She kept asking, please just let me go home, I've made a mistake, and really wanted just some sort of assurance while she was there of what was happening. And just seeing that vulnerability in her, I almost couldn't be angry for what she'd been like on her arrest, because it wasn't personal. But one of the great things about this new sort of trauma-aware policing is that we can actually try and establish those relationships with people to break that down and say, look, yes, okay, you know, I may be sat here in a uniform, and yes, okay, you know, I do go out and I arrest people, but the main role that I do is actually looking after people and is safeguarding, and the age training definitely helped with that, and helped be able to sort of break some of those barriers down between communicating with police and the public, but also between the other agencies that we work with, because prior to this training, there was no communication at all. Now there's constant feedback, and safeguarding a person isn't just, I'll fill out a form for them, it's, I'll speak to them, I'll find out what they need, I'll get them that help, and then I'll follow up afterwards. So it's completely different, really. If you end up visiting maybe a shoplifter or a drug user, and then they start to tell you about these things that happened in earlier life, we're now aware of, okay, I don't just have to sort of sit here and listen and not do anything. I've now actually got the power to find that support in place to try and undo some of that damage.
So I think that kind of really provides a compelling case for how taking that approach has really supported that particular officer's work. And I guess what I've kind of described in the earliest part of the presentation is the closest we've really come to kind of whole system change. But we do kind of have this aspiration, as Joe referred to, in terms of trauma-informed communities. And I guess this is how it looks for us. We have achieved a lot on the journey to becoming a trace-informed nation, but actually we want to go further, and we want to enable our communities to be trauma and ACE-informed and support all members of society to really thrive across North Wales. And we know actually that this approach has never been more important, given the kind of current pandemic, the collective trauma that we've all experienced, but in different ways. And we know that the restrictions have given people limited opportunities to build and maintain resilience factors. But at the same time, as Joe said, we have seen much progressive action. We've seen communities come together in a way, in a variety of innovative ways. There's been much resourcefulness, and there are huge strengths, I think, to celebrate and harness. So this work is really timely, and we want to use that experience of collective trauma to create an opportunity for transformation, to enable really a trauma-informed movement. And we know that this is complex, but I think our sector-specific work puts us in really good stead to be able to take this collaborative action for a truly whole system approach. So just moving on, work is largely conceptual at present around the community stuff, but we do want to create this movement, and I guess there are a number of issues for us to consider in this. We do want to build on that Time to Be Kind campaign, using it as a platform for communication and key messaging to the public around everyone having the ability to make a change to people's lives. We do want to engage with the communities that we serve, and that's crucial, but in doing so we need to really explore the language that we're using and the term trauma-informed approach, or trauma an ACE approach, but make it more accessible, make it more understood, and give people greater ownership of it and really convey its simplicity. And we don't want any of this to kind of be in isolation. This isn't a kind of bolt on. This is about building into what's already there and recognising those community assets and working with them. And we need a clear community definition. And for me, I guess this is about kind of grassroots action with and through our peers, recognising actually that we all belong to a community, and we can all practice a trauma and ACE informed approach where we live, where we work, and actually where we socialise. And this isn't a deficit based model, it's a strengths one, and resilience needs to be the front and centre of that, because actually we know the building blocks of resilience are around access to a stable, supportive adult relationship, feeling connected within our communities. So actually, if that's the case, then this lies within all of our hands, and we can convey that to our public and to our communities. And I suppose ultimately what we want to do is to upscale and adapt all of the work that we've done to date, all of our sector specific work, all of the resources that we've produced, and bring them together and join all of those dots really. And that has to be developmental, and it has to be dynamic, and certainly for the community aspects it has to be organic, and it's surely got to be at the heart of some of the post-COVID recovery planning as well. But just to kind of summarise that, I really like this quote from the Resilience film, which has really kind of resonated with me, and I think is a good summary of the work, that if we put the knowledge of ACEs and trauma into the hands of the public, they will create very wise decisions. So just moving on to my last slide, you might be pleased to hear, there is still more to do, that's really clear. And in order to achieve everything that I've talked about, we've got to realise true transformation and systems change. But actually, just imagine what this could look like and the impact that it could have if we do join those dots and ensure all of this work transcends organisational boundaries. That will make us a truly trauma-informed nation. And I'm going to hand over to Charlotte to talk about how we do transform through systems change.
Oh, hi. So I'm Charlotte, and glad to be here. So I am part of the Hub, and also part of a third sector organisation called Platform. And I suppose after all those wonderful slides, I'm here with a bit more of a sobering message about the reality of making this change in the longer term. And when I first started at the Hub, and I was there from the inception, we got really excited about this just being a catalyst for change and an awakening opportunity for all of us. And I really felt like I'm a social worker by trade and later an academic, but when I saw the ACEs research, particularly coming out of Wales, it's like once you see this stuff, you can't unsee it. And so this is going to be the reason why we're all going to move mountains, and this is going to move us momentously to where we need to get to. And I suppose as the time's gone on, and whilst I am, of course, happy and joyful at the amazing things that have happened, I'm also acutely aware that actually change is slow and change is difficult. And so I suppose I'm here to talk to you about the things that we've been thinking about in that context. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. So Margaret Wheatley, who talks about creating warriors for the human spirit, which is what we're all about, she talks about the standard method for change is some version of gap analysis. So the desired future state is envisioned, plans are made how to fill the gap between this wonderful future and the undesirable present state. Usually people are identified as the problem, and the solution is to train them to become better. We do this to individuals also. What's wrong with you and how do we fix it? So I'm sure many of you will be familiar with that kind of analysis for solving problems. And what happens is then we get hijacked by hope. And I'm myself, those of you who know me, who are listening, know that I'm all the one for being enthusiastic and hopeful. And then I read this quote that said when we're hijacked by hope, expectations are the premeditated disappointments. because it skews us from reality of what's really going on. And I suppose what I've come to learn is actually we need to spend longer understanding the problem before we jump too quickly to solutions. And so whilst we have had some amazing results in the hub, some of those we have to be realistic about their limitations. And as Vicky has said, we've got so much more to do if really what we want is system change. Next slide, please. So those of you who are familiar with the ACES research in Wales, you need to keep pressing. You need to keep pressing loads so all the bubbles come. That's it. But there's 2 more. Yeah. So you'll be familiar. There's 1 more. Here we go. You'll be familiar with this research. So this is Mark Bellis's research that was from 2017. So clearly this was the desired state. This is where we want to get to. We want resilient communities. Rather than focusing on ACES being a deficit model, we want to talk about how to fix the problem, these problems, and build resilient communities. So communities which are culturally connected, those always available adults, which our campaign was very much the call to action for them, being able to guide your destiny and overcome hardship, and managing your behaviours. So how do we activate communities to do that? And we see communities as our resource. Communities are absolutely our resource in tackling this. And the rub of this is really in that, that means this is a collective answer. This is an answer of a collective that would need to make. Whereas we are very much culturally an individualized society. We are an individualized nation, and we're an individualized services. I'll talk more about this later, but already you can see some of the barriers to achieving this. Next slide, please. There's 2 more bubbles. Next slide. Yeah. And the next desired state, so moving on from communities, was public services. And you've heard wonderful presentations today about how we have impacted really positively on all of those. But again, we need to recognise the cultures that are endemic within those organisations. And, you know, over the past 40 years, we need to recognise that the increasingly individualised context of professionalism and expertise, which has led to the new public management paradigm. So that refer me, assess me, manage me model of having to do public services. The stuff that we are talking about, being trauma informed, ACE aware, the very essence of those things, where choice is important, trust is important, autonomy is important, collaboration is important, absolutely jar against the new public management paradigm within many of our services operate, which you'll see we discovered as we went through our work. So next slide, please. So what we did, as you've heard, or certainly I did, so apologies if any of you heard me in my early days going around ranting a lot about how the world needs to change, and can you all just please listen? This is the awakening, and we need to train you all in this stuff, because once you know it, you will make it happen. And then what I quickly learned was the limitations to that. So next slide, please. The research that the psychologically informed environments work that Vicky talked about was my work. And I wrote that training course, and we were grateful and amazed to get Welsh Government funding to train that to all the social landlords, local authorities and supported accommodation staff in Wales. And that is ongoing. It's now in its year 4 iteration of that training. And absolutely, we are seeing an impact. And so do I still believe that psychologically informed environments are the best model of practice for collective areas? So, for example, hostels, anywhere where lots of people with vulnerable issues have to come. So you have to think about whether those environments are psychologically informed or you're not being trauma aware. Yes, of course, but we also have to recognise the limitations. And this came out from a shelter report in 2018, which talked about, yes, we have achieved a greater awareness. We have shifted attitudes. But actually, in practice, often staff's responses didn't reflect the principles of trauma-informed practice. And the reason staff gave for that was they felt the system itself doesn't support this approach. So the computer says no answer. Actually, this is what I want to do, but actually I can't. Next slide, please. And the recommendations of that, the evaluation of that training showed us much the same. They spoke about cultures of needing to manage need. So there's that dominance of that new public management model again. the transactional approach of time constraints. So I've only got so long to be with you, so I actually can't relate to you in the way that I know I should, because actually I need to see my next person, I need to see the next person. The fact that we're audited for money, staff training is audited for money, the closed and targeted nature of their work means that, you know, show me how you measure me and I'll show you how I behave. The need to contain risks. So actually feeling like some of this work is too risky for us. We still hear that from our mental health colleagues. Being trauma informed sometimes feels too risky for us. Our partners don't work in this way, so often we can feel like we're left holding the baby. This came out really strongly from the housing, as you can imagine. If they were moving towards no eviction policies, which they were to their credit, and they still are. So if you're moving towards a no eviction policy because you understand somebody's antisocial behaviour as a symptom of their trauma, but where does that leave you? You're still left with that person who is experiencing the symptoms of their trauma. And unless the system around you comes in to help you with that, you're going to soon feel isolated. Next slide, please. And just more recently, we've been working with a domestic abuse charity, and I just wanted to add this in today because this is still very much alive. And these are the women who we spoke to who've experienced refuge. So, you know, those principles of doing with and not to, building trust, choice, autonomy, collaboration, those are all the principles that we are training people to deliver. But that is not people's experiences of services because of the way those services are commissioned and run, and not because of the attitudes and knowledge of the staff. It's just a really important point to make. Next slide, please. So, you know, you'll all be familiar with wicked problems, and ACEs, of course, is one of them, and we'd be naive to think that it isn't. So you get from, you know, this, I didn't invent this, but the point about evaluations can take a long time. Will you have the leadership and the commissioning capacity to enable that, to wait a long time to see whether you've solved this? They're never completely solved because trauma is a lifelong experience. In fact, collective trauma is all around us. In fact, I would go as far as to say we have some organisations, public service organisations, that if you look at it, they have symptoms of collective trauma themselves in how they respond to people. Etc. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you get the point. Multi-causal, multi-stakeholder, everything's connected to everybody else. So you really need to be working on a systemic level. And we did our own piece of work. Next slide, please. Early days in the ACEs Hub, which I'm glad to say will be in your pack, that I'm not going to go through now, because that would be a whole hour. But our point was the way that if you experienced trauma either as a child or then it manifests as symptoms in you as an adult, and how you rub up against the system, you know, clearly what this model is showing is the system often exacerbates the problem it is intending to solve. And that was the point of that, and us thinking about where we can most effectively make our impact. So next slide, please. So it's Hilary Cottam in her recent book, Radical Health, talks about the welfare state not being fit for purpose. It's at a loss when confronted with a range of modern challenges, from loneliness to entrenched poverty, changing world of work, epidemics of obesity and depression. And so now it's become a management state, an elaborate and expensive system of managing need and their accompanying risks. So you know, we cannot avoid the fact that that is the culture within which we are asking the individuals working, often on the front line, to make this shift. And then, of course, next slide, we have this. So, you know, ever the optimist, the stuff that we started hearing that Joe referred to at the start of this, the stuff that we started hearing that was happening as a response to coronavirus actually was exciting. It sounded like trauma-informed and notions of collectivity, a collective action, community action were coming out. Next slide, please. So an example there from the Children's Society talked about unprecedented levels of collaboration, talked about workers working outside of their boundaries, so goodbye to silos, people being prepared to try new things, and people stepping up and looking out for each other. Next slide, please. And local authorities, and those of you who work in or with local authorities will know words like trust, friendship, turbo speed, and kindness in that quote there. So here we go. has coronavirus been the opportunity for the revolution? So we undertook our own listening exercise. Next slide, please. So in partnership with the Hub, very grateful to Joe for the time and resources put to this. We ended up talking to 200 workers across multiple sectors and communities, so including, real mutual aid voluntary organisations not being paid by anyone, up to, police leads. So in the end, about 240 people spoke to us. So what did we find? So as you might expect, we found very deep wells of empathy. We found workers really digging in very deep. We found workers really enjoying connecting, sharing and sense making just as an end in itself. That's really important if you hold on to that for later. Not because there had to be an outcome, just because sharing was so important. And we also refreshingly found an increased contextual understanding of distress. So instead of this, there's something wrong with you, we must refer you, we must signpost you, as you heard the women from the domestic abuse charity saying that's not helpful, needing to be fixed, their problems, their symptoms of trauma needing to be fixed. Actually, what coronavirus helped us all with is a much broader contextual understanding of distress that actually collectively we can contain. Next slide, please. We saw, as you'd imagine, a huge rise in mutual aid. We saw a shift excitingly to what matters and shared missions. There was tangible excitement about barriers that were coming down, flexibility, speed and agility. But there's a downside to that, if you can, next slide. So some of the not so great stuff that came out. So digital warmth, yes, ways to connect in ways that we wouldn't have imagined, but actually also digital strain. So people feeling like the digital revolution was also a chance to be checked up on, was also a chance to feel more isolated. Having to see yourself back looking stressed was really not helpful on a daily basis. And that's my favourite phrase of all the slides, of where there was rigidity before, there became frigidity. I'm really sorry to say we did see the public management framework, so that I must retreat to my expert position and not engage with you in any relational way, did increase in some areas. And that's what I mean by change in leadership styles for better and worse. We saw some leaders absolutely push the trust and autonomy down to the frontline workers, and people in mutual aid groups feeling they had the trust and autonomy of their communities, until actually a leader got involved and wanted to formalise it. So the downside of leadership was where trust wasn't there. And it's absolutely clear that organisations where there was high levels of trust, autonomy, choice, collaboration, the well-being levels of those staff were that much greater, that therefore they were more able to work in trauma-informed ways. Next slide, please. So I think I've already said about public service. I don't need to say that again. So next slide, please, which leads us to this really, which is that, culture eats strategy every time. So actually this is about shifting culture. So next slide, please. So we're next. So, this has to be about, oh, sorry about the not spelling on that one. This has to be about recognising ourselves as part of the problem. As Vicky's already said, we are part of communities ourselves, and we are leaders ourselves. We are in charge of organisation and cultures ourselves. And so we really have to take a look at our role in this, in perhaps setting people up to fail, in just giving them knowledge and expecting them to do great things. The next slide, please. And in recognising that this individualised culture that I talk about being so predominant, both in our organisations and in our worlds, that just to be careful that it doesn't eat us up, that actually we don't just want to be saying that we're doing great things, signposting great things, telling the world how to be great, because actually we need the affirmation ourselves, we need the likes ourselves, we need the funding ourselves. That compassion without ambition really is the way that we'll get this work done. And the next slide, please. And back to the point about white privilege and inequality, that it's easy for us here, the holders of all the information, to not be activists ourselves. And I suppose I just wanted to make about the next slide, please, that if we're not including everybody in this, then we won't achieve anything. And so just finally, because the model, this two loops model, this is Margaret Wheatley again. Some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with this. So this is a theory of change model. I'll describe it to you quickly because it's really not complicated, and actually it's very enlightening. So the first loop there on the left, the one going over the top, is the old system. So if we use the example of climate change, so you would recognise that we discover fossil fuels, we all get exciting, we create roles that enables us to drive amazing cars and heat our houses, and that's how the economy builds and all our culture builds in that way. As you get to the top of that that paradigm or that way of living, some innovators start to realize that actually there's no future to this. Those amazing engineers come up with solar panels, battery operated cars. Those are the innovators that drop down to create the new model that's coming below. And some of those activists, those young people changing the world, Greta. And so just go back to the old models. Then on the way down, that the old model is dying, and there are some people in hospice. There are some people who are going to need help with the death of this old model in order to transition over to the new model, and then come to the new model. So what those innovators need is to be named. They need to have a name to feel like they belong, so that they have an identity, and then they need to connect with networks of other people like them. And then they need to be nourished in communities of practice. And then when we have all this evidence and movement, we can illuminate these ways, system influences for other people to more easily transition over to the new model without having to, feel like they're in hospice and dying and irrelevant for the rest of their lives. So just thinking about that, and if you think about wanting to create a collective response to trauma, which is the desired state, without telling people what to do and training them, because that actually doesn't understand the complexity of the problem. When I say without, I mean without only doing that. It has to be much more nuanced and complex in our responses. Then this offers you an opportunity. You need to be looking after the stewards who are still driving the car whilst we're changing the wheel, frankly. So there are some old school, people still working. We need to look after those in hospice. So that is where the well-being of change, how are we looking after people as we're expecting them to change, is massive. And we need to do much more about connecting with people and nourishing communities of practice if this is going to be a systemic change. That last slide, which I think leads back to Joe. That's all from me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Oh, that's a bit of an echo. Do you want to put yourself on mute, Charlotte?
Sorry, yeah.
There we are. So yeah, thank you ever so much. I think that's brought us back around to really kind of where we started, and I hope you've all enjoyed the range of information that you've been given today. We've heard obviously about the Violence Prevention Unit and the detail of that, which is great to share, because we're really proud of the work that has been developing there, and hope that the learning from that has been of use to our colleagues from other violence reduction units that joined us today, but also that more holistic approach to what we're doing in Wales. So how we've come together really as a group of separate projects, which on paper look perhaps very different because they're funded differently and separately, but actually, as I said, we have that shared ambition and shared vision to all achieve the same thing. And I'm just going to move, if you can move to the next slide, Bryony. What we're trying to now articulate, and this is quite difficult to see, but how do we put this down as a theory of change? How do we show what it is that we have been doing and what it is that we are expecting to see? So this is our theory of change in terms of preventing that broad spectrum of adversity, ACEs and the wider experience and trauma in Wales. And I think probably we'll need to do some more work on this as we think about all of the different strands and all the different places where we're doing so much at a government level. I mentioned the Welsh Government are doing a review of ACEs. I think that will really inform this as well, but also to be very clear on what we have done. And I hope that's come across today in terms of the achievements of the ACE Support Hub, the achievements of the Early Action Together programme. And really, this is an exciting year for us because I think we can pull this all together to set out our vision effectively for one public service and an integrated model in Wales. So we have a little bit of time to take some questions. and to hear from others. So if there's any questions, now's your chance to stick them in the chat, and if there's anything that you particularly want to raise. But I'm just going to pass the floor initially to Justin Shrivastava. Justin, I hope you're still there, because obviously we're not the only show in town. There's been a lot of work going on across the UK looking at this stuff. So really would like to invite Justin just to talk a little bit briefly about the work that you've been doing just in Lancashire.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Joe. I suppose the first thing to start off with is my name's Justin Shrivastava. I work part-time on the Violence Reduction Unit in Lancashire, but I also work doing Four Nations work on behalf of the National Police Chiefs Council, looking at public health approaches and trauma-informed approaches across the UK. And what struck me today from all the presentations is, firstly, the great work that's going on in Wales, but secondly, how there's so much learning there that's translatable across into England, and that journey has started. So we tend to, I think it was John who mentioned at the very beginning, asking the question of, well, if you've got devolved governments and if you've got primary legislation, how translatable is it into England? And I would say, actually, it's very translatable. Lancashire has got a really strong relationship with Wales and has done for a number of years, particularly around our trauma-informed schools work that we've shared learning from. We've also shared some of our workforce development practice, but perhaps most importantly, in 2018, Lancashire declared itself as a trauma-informed county. And that was based around the chief executives of all of the various authorities coming together with a shared ambition and a shared system and cultural change approach. As always happens, they got the why that's important. They struggle with the what and the how. And what we saw with both safeguarding reforms and then subsequently violence reductions money is the ability to start shaping the what and the how. And we've seen some shared working across both Wales and England in that regard. I just want to touch on a couple of things, though, Joe, if I may. The first bit is around the Four Nations work that we're doing. And in February, we're looking at having the first National Police Chiefs Council Four Nations conference around public health approaches in policing. And we'll be looking for getting the best practice that we can that's upscalable across the system to be presented at that conference. It's quite an exciting one because it's going to be co-produced by both the World Health Organization and, for those of you who know it, GLEPA, which is the Global Law Enforcement and Public Health Association. So we're looking forward to that. It'd be remiss of me if I didn't mention in England we have the National Police and Health Consensus that was brought about between the National Police Chiefs Council, Public Health England as it was, and NHS England, about working together around vulnerability. A number of local areas have taken that high-level consensus and then used it to start the conversation with their local providers at a local level to design local consensuses. And a couple of note there would be Lancashire, North Wales, as a couple of examples, in Gloucestershire that have managed to translate some of that consensus learning. So I don't want to take too much of the floor, but what the important thing is there, that we want to try and get the learning together. We want to break it out across both England and Wales. And I know John and Joe and I have had a number of conversations about how we might do that. And the Home Office funding has given us some real opportunities to make it better.
Fantastic, Justin. Thank you ever so much. And I think there probably is now going to be a whole raft of questions around. I can see one from Sarah Dodds around that event. So I'm sure you'll be able to provide some further information on that. That's great. OK, is there anything from anybody else? Does anyone would like to raise a question? Is there anything in the chat, Bryony, that I've missed? No? OK, well, in that case, I'll start with a question and then see if that provokes any further kind of conversations to go on. So one of the things I think that we've learnt from the discussion today is the point of the webinar was evidence into practice. So I wondered, Emma or Anne-Marie, if you'd like to talk a little bit more about the importance of evaluation and how that was really kind of central, I guess, to the Early Action Together programme, and the importance of that going forward as we move towards new models of trauma-informed approach. How will we know that they work?
Sorry, I totally lost my mute button. Yeah, I think I mean, obviously, it's crucial to have that evidence base of what works, and I think the sort of the way forward is that continual evaluation of programs and the long term. I mean, short term evaluations are great, and that's obviously the first step, but certainly when you're looking around ACEs and adverse child experiences and trauma, and we've heard a lot today about the fact that it's a generational, or it can be have a generational impact, that actually you need therefore a generation in which to evaluate. So a lot of these evaluations, a lot of the programs will need a long-term evaluation plan, evaluation strategy. Obviously that's all can be determined by funding and other issues as well, but I think it's important because the idea of continual evaluation means that you can, it's a moving playing field, so you can continue to feed into the, I mean, it's something that we did with the Early Action Together programme was that we didn't just sit on the research and not do anything with it until the end of the programme. It was constant, the results were constantly being fed into the programme, so we could sort of change it on the go, really, so that we could start to look at actually what are the recommendations, how could we improve, and then you sort of go back and reevaluate that. So I think that's the importance of evaluation is critical, but the importance of ongoing evaluation, I think, is just as important.
Thank you, Emma. And John, I wonder if I could call on you as well in terms of the one of the key elements of the Violence Prevention Unit is obviously the collection of data and presentation of data. And one of your projects that's responding particularly to COVID at the moment is a monitoring report. I think it's monthly. Do you want to just say a little bit about that and how important it is to keep that partnership approach to data collection at the heart of what we do?
Yes, certainly, Joe. I mean, I think I said in my presentation, first step of that public health model is really to understand what's going on. And, I think anyone would say that being able to make sure there's no hidden harm, in other words, one agency holding information that keeps someone safe, is always going, and sharing that data, sharing that information is always going to be the first step if we're to make progress in preventing adverse childhood experiences and preventing violence indeed. So one of the sort of quite big pieces of work we've done is developing our sort of violence surveillance approach across Wales. So using police, health data, various third sector data, as well as a lot of soft intelligence into trying to give a really rich picture of what violence looks like across Wales, and making sure that we're using that sort of best evidence base really in terms of planning interventions and all the work of the VPU and its partners. So I think it's a really important first step. And, although there's always difficulties around things like data sharing, not letting that get in the way of the mission, that's actually using that data to prevent violence. That's what we're certainly there for. And of course, preventing trauma and adverse childhood experiences more widely as well, playing our part in that. So thanks very much.
Thank you, John. Vicky, I'm going to come on to you next. I think one of the key aspects of your presentation was towards the end was to touch on how do we get people to engage with this if it's a language that perhaps that means something different for them. So one of the things that we've been thinking about, isn't it, is around what does trauma informed mean in terms of different agencies, different sectors, different practices. Do you want to say a little bit about the conversation that's going on in North Wales and how you think we could land that better?
Yeah, I think so. Some of it, Joe, I guess I kind of started to pick up on in the presentation around the time to be kind stuff and how I find it quite frustrating because I guess trauma and ACE informed absolutely means something to me, but to other people they recognise it as something that belongs to specialists, and actually we have to convey that simplicity. So with our work with Glyndŵr University, we're already starting through their civic mission to engage further and wider and broader than that work, but actually we're going to be working also with the 2025 movement up here in North Wales, who are a movement all about tackling social inequalities. So absolutely recognising that this is far wider than just ACEs and how we kind of tackle that as a collective, really. So that will bring in those community connections, and we need to start kind of consulting with people about what things mean to them and actually what is understandable, and kind of exploring some more around that collective language, I guess.
Thank you, Vicky. And there's a question from Graham Robb, thank you, Graham, around experience already about how this learning can inform and improve work by engaging with specific ethnic communities. Thank you, Graham. That's a really helpful question, because it reminds me to remind us collectively that one of the key achievements, I guess, from last year, was published this year, was some work that we did looking at the specific impact of ACEs on refugee and asylum seeking children. So although not a specific ethnic community, we can certainly say that as a group, that those children are particularly marginalised, have particular experience that very thankfully many of us will never experience. So I think there's more to do in that space, Graham, and I certainly think that our experience so far has told us that we need to do more engagement and through a particular conversation that makes everyone feel included in this conversation. So really pleased that we're going to be joined shortly by a research assistant that's going to help us to take forward some of this work in terms of the specific experiences of some of our communities. So be keen to keep in touch on that. So just to close, as I think we've come to the end now of the webinar, and to thank everybody for taking part, I'd just like to give the last word to Charlotte, if I may. So Charlotte, on your presentation, you talked about that you are a person that has hope. Do you still have hope after what you've heard today, that we can really become that ACE-aware, trauma-informed nation?
I think she's left.
Oh, Charlotte. Okay, I think she would have said that she did. How about end on that? So I'll end with it and saying, well, from everything that I've heard today, and I hope all of you have as well, that I think we really do have hope. And having hope is not a bad thing if we use all our learning and all our experience to turn our tankers in the right direction and collectively work towards what I think is a shared vision and a shared ambition across all of us. So thank you very much for your time today. Thanks to all the presenters for your fantastic presentation and for the contributions in the chat, and look forward to seeing you all again in the future. Many thanks.